Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, my name's Logan. I'm 11 years old, and this is my podcast and YouTube channel. It's called You're Welcome Without Asking. The point of it is to do the investigating for you, to be able to give you the answers to the questions you didn't even know you needed to ask. With the help of my dad and some pretty cool guests, that's what I hope to do. This marks 1 year of doing these videos and podcasts. Today's episode is all about Bigfoot. We have a special guest today, Dr. Jeff Medrum. So here's Your Welcome Without Asking.
Good job, buddy. So since launching this show last Christmas, Logan has covered topics ranging from best dad joke, one of my favorites, to best spicy chip, to best grocery store sushi.
Oh,
scientific method. I mean, you have to compare them.
Right.
It was great. We've even done best Mighty Morphin Power Ranger. And I can't be more proud of Logan, because with each of these episodes, he comes up with the topic and he starts with best, but then he works to operationalize the term best. And so, for example, best spicy chip, he compared price, he compared heat, and then he compared flavor. And we literally moved the bags one by one until he had come to his outcome. And it's been so much fun.
That's great.
He's just taken this idea of the show and he's run with it. But obviously I couldn't be more excited about today's topic and our guest, Dr. Meldrum, for two main reasons. Okay, one, Logan, I don't know if you know this, but I'm pretty sure you did your postdoctoral visitor professorship at Duke, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I've spent
At
about
Duke.
2.5 years.
Do you know who in this family is arguably the biggest Duke fan you've ever met?
Peyton.
Peyton learned it from her granddaddy. So when your granddaddy finds out that you talked to somebody who actually taught at Duke, you're going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
But the second one is that we're talking about Bigfoot. And I've used Bigfoot this semester in two of my college courses, criminal justice college courses. And I don't know if you can see or not, but I've required the family to wear matching Sasquatch pajamas as their Christmas sweaters.
Excellent. Great.
Logan, Dr. Meldrum has been equated in some of the stuff that I've watched to the Jane Goodall of Sasquatch.
Okay.
Right. By my count, and I'm sure this is not accurate, just by my count, I counted 16 different shows, movies, documentaries that I know that you've been in, as well as a number of books that you have authored and then been cited in, as like probably more than you even know, right? Sure. I was watching something on the Discovery Channel and they were interviewing a Bigfoot researcher, and in the background of this researcher, there was a hat hanging on the wall, and the hat was the Stay Squatchy or whatever that Bobo always wore on Animal Planet.
Right.
And so both the researcher and I know the guy who wears the hat and the Discovery Channel, all three referenced you as like a very authoritative figure in this one episode. So it's just a big deal for us. I mean, you've been on the History Channel, Animal Planet, all these documentaries, all these things. But I wanted to, before kicking it off to Logan, I wanted to make sure it's important to note that you're not taking time out of your day Bigfooting in the woods to talk to us, that you are a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State and have been since the early 90s?
93, yeah.
1993. Yeah. And I have here, I'm going to read it because it's too lengthy for me to have memorized. You ready? His research centers on the evolution of hominin bipedalism. How'd I do?
Excellent.
You're going to have to say that a bunch of times. You ready?
Oh.
Professional interest in the footprints that I've been showing you are attributed to Sasquatch began when you personally examined a line of footprints. Those were 15-inch tracks.
Yep.
And off the top of your head, do you remember how long that sequence of tracks was?
Oh, it went on for several hundred yards. There were 35, 45 absolutely clear tracks in the mud, and we could have gone further had time permitted. I think we kind of focused on trying to document what was immediately there available, and didn't go beyond. I kick myself now that we didn't, but that's the way things go at the time.
Right. Understand, and always learning. And that's something that I know we're going to talk about, but I've heard even just in some of your interviews how your thought process has evolved about evidence and collection and stuff. So
Definitely.
25 years later, and you have over 300 footprint casts.
That's right. At least.
And that's amazing. And I loved in the bio the term relict hominoids.
Correct. Right.
And that's something that I've been kind of schooling Logan on, and I figured that you were probably going to bring it up in the conversation with him today. Dr. Meldrum conducts collaborative laboratory and field research throughout the world and has shared findings in numerous, as I've already said, numerous popular and professional publications, presentations, interviews, television appearances, and now your show.
There we go.
You're kind of a big deal. He wrote the book Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, and that was the reason that I reached out to him and wanted him to be where you ask these questions, because he is seen as where speculation and interpretation actually becomes scientific. And so that's what I really like about the work that he does and the stuff that he puts out.
Excuse me.
Published 2 field guides, which is pretty cool, and may get a chance to talk about. One focused on Sasquatch, the second cast the net more broadly and considers the potential of that relict hominid species that I was telling you about, and that there may be just that we haven't classified correctly. And he's also the editor-in-chief of a scholarly refereed journal, the Relict Hominoid Inquiry, which I have pulled up and have read several of the articles on. It's on the ISU website, and which is now in the 12th year. So,
yeah,
pretty cool, right? So, Dr. Meldrum, thank you. Obviously, you are way more qualified than anything we could have ever imagined. And I didn't want to start off by asking you the typical, how did you get involved? What kind of thing? Because it seems like that's what everybody asks you.
Certainly, yeah, it does.
So I have a specific question in mind that I'm going to ask you, but it's going to piggyback off of the questions that Logan has written. So I think we'll just turn it over to him and let him drive. And thank you for taking time to do this with us.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Yeah.
You got it, bud.
That's the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question that we have is Bigfoot real?
Well, that's the ultimate objective, is to determine that. Certainly the phenomenon is without question real. I mean, it is a figure, a character that inhabits at least the cultural landscape, the social landscape, and even economic. I mean, Sasquatch makes money for a lot of people. The question is, does it inhabit the natural landscape? Is it a biological species? And that was kind of the premise of my book, is simply, is there a biological species that we can grapple with scientifically behind the legend of Sasquatch, the stories? One of my former department chairs, who, as we were suggesting, was not so enthusiastic about my participation in this kind of activity. He said to me, "Well, after all, Jeff, these are just stories." And I said, well, stories that appear to leave footprints, shed hair, void scat, vocalize, are witnessed by credible outdoorsmen and professionals, field biologists, etc. I said, it's a lot more than just stories. And that's the path, that's the trail of evidence that is left behind that we must evaluate and attempt to try to demonstrate. I mean, ultimately the convention in life sciences is to establish and recognize a species on the basis of some physical remains, a bone or a body, something like that. In some instances, a DNA sample is sufficient. But even that is kind of marginal. They want a specimen that can be labeled as a type. And so short of that, we're just considering the evidence that points to the potential existence. To ignore that is really unscientific, isn't it, in my mind?
And I think that's a really good lead into the next question that you had. So if he's going to convince you that Bigfoot is real, and by him I mean your dad's going to convince you that Bigfoot's real. Actually, you know what? Before getting into that evidence, he asked me a good question. That well, here I'll let you ask him.
So the next question that we have is, what is the difference between Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, and such?
Right. That's a good question. And that leads into this notion of the term relic hominoid, which is a term that was used by a Russian cultural anthropologist, Boris Porzhnev, decades ago. He is now deceased, but he really attempted to draw attention to what he saw as evidence that some species of man-like monsters still, in fact, do exist. These monsters are really just part of the natural adaptive radiation, the diversity of species that we call hominoids, which means man-like, because of their superficial appearance, resemblance to us. We now know in terms of the evolutionary history of our own species that we weren't this one single lineage that was marching through time amongst the rest of nature, but we were a branch on a very bushy tree with lots of not so dissimilar species that coexisted across the landscape with us, or with our ancestors. And now the question is, do they still coexist with us? For the longest time in anthropology, it was thought that the niche, the sort of home address in the ecology of our species was a very exclusive club, and there could be only one member in it. And so the suggestion that there were these other types of creatures was just considered to be, folklore and stories. But now, in the past, 30, 40 years, the fossil record of these hominoids or hominins, and these words have subtle differences of meaning, and it's kind of beyond the scope of our conversation, I think, to really dissect them, but they are different. And the word hominoid, not only in a more informal sense, means man-like, but it also denotes a species that's in the superfamily Hominoidea, which includes us and the great apes, and all the fossils that would be allied with those living species in the past. And so when we put relict in front of it, in biology, relict means, and that's with a T at the end. There's relic without a T, which is more like used with antiquities, and archaeologists use that when they dig up relics, from a past civilization. But a relict species is a holdover. It is the persistence of a population of animals in time and space where they are much more restricted in distribution and number. So, a remnant would be maybe a synonym. So relict hominoids are now considered to be branches on this bushy tree that have survived alongside us, instead of having all gone extinct with the exception of us. And the evidence is continually mounting. I mean, we recently, you may remember the discovery of the Hobbit. Homo floresiensis was its scientific name, but they dubbed it the Hobbit because it was only about 3.5 feet tall and very human-like in many regards, but unhuman-like in many others. And it was thought to have gone extinct remarkably recently. I mean, initially they were talking 13 to 18,000 years. That's been pushed back a little further, but still, just tens of thousands of years for a species that looks like things that we find in the fossil record as long ago as 2 million years back in Africa. And so there are example after example of other things. Homo erectus in Southeast, and these are names that I know may not mean a whole lot, but a number of species that well, let's put it this way. If I stepped into a time machine, turned the dial to go back just 30, 40,000 years ago, stepped off in East Asia, for example, walked around, I could bump into any one of maybe 6 or 7 different species of man-like creatures. And so that's really quite amazing. 10 or 20, 30,000 years is just a snap of the fingers in geologic time. And so when we consider that in concert with the fact that there are all these reports, not just stories, but footprints and hair samples and vocalizations and eyewitness accounts of Sasquatch, of the Yeti, which is much more ape-like. It has a footprint that looks more like a chimpanzee with a divergent big toe, of the Russian almas, which I tell you, its description and its behaviors as described by witnesses, it looks and it lives in the right place to be one of these relic populations of, say, Neanderthals. And then we've got the Orang Pendek, the Ibu Gogo, the Ndutu. These are all names for the little people of Southeast Asia that very possibly could be the living representative, connecting the dots for the Hobbit, for Homo floresiensis. So there's at least 4 different relic hominoids. And every once in a while we get stories of possibly others. There's a fascinating book by an author, a conservationist from South Africa, about the wild men that they have stories of in these mountains of South Africa, quite removed from all these other places that we've been talking about. And who knows, that could be a lingering population of some form of a fossil hominid ancestor like an Australopithecine. So, and I know some of these words are getting up in the stratosphere, but the Australopithecines were just they were essentially like bipedal chimpanzees. They still had brains that were very small. Their teeth were getting bigger and had thicker enamel. They didn't have the long projecting canine teeth. They were just starting to manipulate stone tools. So, if you can imagine something, very similar to a chimpanzee that was shaped in its hips and the lengths of its legs, much more like a human than a chimp, walking in a much more modern looking fashion. That's what we mean by Australopithecines.
I know you got to buy that, because he tried to convince me that the T-Rex turned into a chicken.
Yeah. T-Rex's cousin, the little what were they called? The compies, Compsognathus, they weren't too far off of looking like chickens. I don't think they don't deck them out in the full potential plumage that they may have had, as some of the fossils are starting to indicate. Some of these dinosaurs looked an awful lot like chickens with all the feathers they had.
So you did a much better job than my attempt to explain it to him, because I think I used polar bears and grizzly bears and black bears all being bears, and that was about as far as my explanation was able to go. Yeah. And that they adapted to their environment and evolved over time. So that was about as far as I got. So his was way more. Mm-hmm. All right. So ask him your next.
My next question is, what evidence besides a body do you have to prove that Bigfoot's real?
Right. Well, short of proving, I think it's important to make the distinction that, as we mentioned earlier, the ultimate proof comes in the form of a body. And so recognizing that, I'm not suggesting that the evidence I have proves it, but it's very convincing. You know, I sometimes, people sometimes ask me if, as your T-shirt suggests there, Derek, that, you know, do I believe? And I'll sometimes surprise them when I very bluntly say, well, no, I don't believe in Bigfoot. What are you doing? I said, you know, when you say, especially when a non-scientist says believe, I believe in something, it means that they've accepted the idea of something really in the absence of proof. It's kind of like faith, you know, if we speak in spiritual terms, faith is, you know, and some people will quibble, you know, faith is the evidence of things not seen, but it's basically accepting the existence of something or the influence of something in the absence of demonstrable proof. So I actually was given a T-shirt that said believing since 1967, and it had a background picture of the Patterson-Gimlin film, which was shot in 1967. And I took a big black marker and I put a line through believing, and then I wrote over the top of it, convinced since 1967. Oops. So I'm convinced on the basis of the evidence that at the very least we're justified in pursuing this as a legitimate scientific question. And the evidence is remarkably compelling. It, if not conclusive, it certainly is persuasive to anyone who will study it and understand it, of the very possible and if not probable existence of Sasquatch. So for me, given my expertise and what actually drew me into this topic, it was the footprint evidence, because my specialty is the interpretation of the evolution of the adaptation of the human foot to walking, to the habit of walking on 2 feet instead of 4. And so obviously that's one of the fascinating aspects presented by the potential existence of Bigfoot for me, is another comparison to the human condition. Comparison and contrast, and do they walk like us? Do they have feet shaped like us? And it's been really interesting and revealing that actually they don't. You know, you might think if someone were simply hoaxing all this, they might simply use a human foot as the pattern and just enlarge it, you know, bigger. But in reality, the Sasquatch feet are quite distinct in their basic architecture from the human foot. The human foot, you know, is most foremost characterized by a longitudinal arch. And so, you know, when you see a footprint there by the swimming pool, it has a very distinctive hourglass shape that shows that medial arch. On the other hand, or in contrast, the Sasquatch foot has never evolved that arch. It actually emerged very, very recently in human evolution. And many of our hominin ancestors, way back when they first started walking on 2 legs, were also, like Sasquatch, walking on flat, flexible feet with a midfoot break or axis of flexion. And the Sasquatch has elaborated upon that strategy to accommodate its massive size, its weight. And it, you know, just wouldn't make sense for it to have an arched foot. So that, for me, because I can appreciate it, I can evaluate that evidence very from a very informed position, and objectively, I believe I can deal with that. That's been by far the most convincing. It's also the most prolific. You know, as your dad pointed out, I now have over 300 footprint casts and hundreds of photographs of footprints in the ground from all over North America, and other examples associated with some of these other species of relic hominoid. And the footprints often are what distinguish these other forms of relic hominoid from Sasquatch. They're not just, you know, a Sasquatch in a different place. Now, in some instances, yes, there seems to be a circum-Pacific distribution of Sasquatch. That is North America, but also in Asia and East Asia down into the southeastern part, and then up along flanking the Himalayas, all the way over to the Caucasus Mountains. This is how I learned geography, was when I got interested in Sasquatch when I was about your age, and I was reading the books and learning the names of all these mountain ranges and the continents and distribution of animals. Those footprints are remarkably similar. And that's one of the things for me that doesn't prove, but I mean, it's the smoking gun, is when I went over, had the opportunity to go to China and actually examine some footprints attributed to the Chinese wild man called the Yeren, which is simply Chinese for wild man. The footprints were indistinguishable from the Sasquatch tracks that I was familiar with. But if you look at those rare footprints attributed to the Yeti, the ones that are intelligible, that can tell you something, because a lot of them are just melted out depressions in the snow and are not very informative. But the couple, 2 or 3 examples that look, like I said, more like a tree climbing ape. So they're not living all on the ground all the time. They're going up over these snowy passes between these high forested valleys, and they're climbing around, probably, sleeping and eating and so forth in the trees, just like other great apes. And then the Almasti, the one that I said was a lot like a Neanderthal, it has a foot that has an arch. It looks the most like a human, except they're extremely broad and robust, which is what we, understand the Neanderthal physique to be like. And then the orang pendek, we still don't have a really good solid fossil or a footprint record for it. Some of the footprints have suggested it may have a divergent big toe, or at least a form, but the classic orang pendek footprints look like little human footprints with narrow heels. In fact, that raises the question, a narrow heel is also characteristic of bear hind paws. And so some of those tracks may actually be misidentified bear tracks, the Malaysian sun bear, for example, in Southeast Asia. So footprints
smaller as well. So I see some of the footprints and how they're shaped for the huge size of what Sasquatch is believed to be.
Right.
Is like your height, maybe, give or take.
Yeah.
Understood. I have, if it'll work, I have a footprint photograph. It's one of the popular images.
Sure.
And I just wanted to pull it up so that if I can share it with you, so that you can maybe point out some things for him that you see. You'll know this is the one with the matchbook in the middle of the print. You know which one I'm talking about?
Yes, I think so. I think I do. Yeah.
And if this works correctly. Go with me 1 second, and then I think
you can screen.
Okay,
sure.
Cool. Here we go.
I don't know if it'll do it without, but it won't do it because we're recording. Probably not.
Well, that shouldn't hold it up if you.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. Now that I believe, if I remember correctly, is I think that's one of the footprints that was attributed to the Bosberg Cripplefoot up in Washington State. My memory could be failing me there, and it's a little tough to interpret. People have this unfortunate habit of, they've already got the matchbook in place, and you should never put the scale inside the footprint. You should put it beside the footprint. Likewise, you should never stick your hands into the footprint for the possibility of leaving your own fingerprints, but also, obscuring the image. So but you can, some of the things you can see, the Sasquatch footprint is characterized by its flatness, the lack of a pronounced longitudinal arch. The heel segment is to provide greater leverage for its heavy animal, is relatively longer and very rounded, since it's taking up weight on that heel. very broad. The breadth to length ratios of the Sasquatch foot are quite distinct. If you plot data for a large sample of alleged Sasquatch footprints and human footprints, they fall out. Length versus width ratios, they fall out in two separate clouds because they're that much wider in order to provide sufficient surface area that the compressive forces over that sole of the foot, the pounds per square inch of surface, are relatively comparable to our own. I mean, it's the limits of living tissue, and they have adapted both anatomically by having a flat foot with the weight distributed over a broader area all the time, and also even the way they walk. So they don't come down with a real sharp heel strike and then a toe off, which would make a track that has differentially deep imprint under the heel and under the ball of the foot and toes. Instead, it's more evenly compressed. And then the behavioral aspects. So when they walk, they seem to walk with what we call a compliant gait. That is, their hips and their knees, especially, and ankles, stay a little bit flexed. They don't pole vault over an extended leg like we tend to do. And so by doing that reduces the impact forces, the peak forces underneath those pressure points that are typical of a human gait pattern. So it's very different, very distinct, and that's the thing. If again, and I always hate to constantly fall back to the question, if these were hoaxed, would the hoaxer think of that? But it really is. It's important to kind of keep it in the back of your mind so that you are impressed by the fact that so many aspects of this evidence, so many aspects are correlated in such a coherent, rational, biomechanically sound, evolutionarily appropriate way, that if this were just a bunch of random hoaxes by different people who don't have the background in biomechanics and functional morphology and evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology, who don't know those things, how would they possibly get it right so many times, it seems, that it actually fits? And not only get it right in a way that at the time was counterintuitive to what was considered conventional wisdom in science. This is one of the best arguments, for the Patterson-Gimlin film over my shoulder there, is that was shot in 1967. When you look at that film with the understanding of anthropology in 1967, you can appreciate why the, quote, experts of the time said, oh, it can't be real. It can't exist. So it's got to be a hoax. And so this is probably why, and this is probably why, and this is probably why, pointing out silly things that made no sense. And yet now, 50 plus years later, science has kind of caught up with the film. And these things that were contradictory, were counterintuitive in 1967, are spot on. They're absolutely correct based on what we understand now. So it anticipated the discovery, the independent discovery of those phenomena. For example, I'll give you one example here. This one, Dr. John Napier was a primatologist at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He was also very influential in developing the discipline of study of primate locomotion, how primates move, and of course how we move. And so he was a very accomplished anatomist and a physician. He was an MD as well as a PhD. He was also on the panel of scientists at the Smithsonian that viewed the Patterson-Gimlin film for the first time. He was obviously impressed enough by the whole topic that he, in his later years, as he was approaching retirement, had a little more academic freedom, then he actually wrote a book about Bigfoot. One of the first books written by a PhD, by a doctor, a scientist of his standing. And when it came to the chapter on the Patterson-Gimlin film, and harking back to his experience viewing it, he said he had to offer a negative opinion, but he admitted that he had a hard time really coming up with a good rationale for justifying that rejection. But he said, when I look at what's on that film, he said, from the waist up, it essentially looks like an ape. It does. It looks like basically like a gorilla. But from the waist down, it has the hips and the legs that look essentially like a modern human almost. And then he said, for such a hybrid, such an unexpected combination of traits to exist in one creature, he says, is nearly inconceivable. So it must be a hoax. It must be a contrivance. And so he rejected it. Well, that book came out in the early 70s, 1972, I think. And a few years later, there was the announcement of one of those Australopithecines. This one they dubbed Lucy, because they were listening to, Elton John, Beatles. Lucy, isn't Beatles Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds? Anyway, whatever it was, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So they grabbed the name Lucy and they attached that, as paleontologists often do. They name their fossils. But for the first time, we had much more extensive skeletal remains of this species. We had hips, we had knees, and all these things showed a whole lot of interesting characteristics. But when they described this discovery to the popular press, they said, isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks just like a chimpanzee. And yet from the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, that was the very inconceivable combination of traits that Napier justified his rejection of the Patterson-Gimlin film. What if he had waited 10 years before that book was published? Maybe his conclusions about the film would have been very different, because, like I said, the science caught up. Now, what was inconceivable is conventional. That's what these early bipedal hominins looked like. They were essentially, as I described earlier, bipedal chimpanzees. So that's a really important illustration of how this phenomenon has very persuasive aspects to it, and why it does frustrate me continually when people, and especially when my colleagues who should be objective, critically minded, but objective, curious intellectuals, reject this out of hand without understanding or even attempting to understand the evidence that forms the basis of the motivation of individuals like myself. It's just, to fall back on this position, it can't exist, therefore it doesn't. It just reveals your own ignorance of the science, quite bluntly.
Some of the other attempts to show evidence are those kinds of similar responses. They're like, well, yeah, it could be, but it also could be these kind of things. Examples that I've shown him are things like the nests.
Yeah.
And I saw them on some of the documentaries, and I've read into them a little bit. And I know you've done a little bit of work, I think, if I remember, trying to actually gather some DNA out of those nests.
We did. Yeah. I had the opportunity, the privilege to go into the site after it'd been about 4 or 5 years already that they were kind of monitoring, hoping there might be renewed activity. But it appears that this is a episodic kind of event. They have actually found other examples of nests of varying ages, based on the deterioration, of the vegetation out of which they're constructed. I honestly think it was just a kind of a special occasion, and that special occasion might very well have been something like a birthing event, which is a fairly rare event in a large-bodied ape like this. But one of the nests was this smaller nest that was built right up in the crotch of a bush, about 2 feet off the ground, and some of the investigators have said that it was maybe just a practice nest, that the little ones were building nests. But it looked to me like a bassinet. And I wondered if it could have been something like that. But anyway, we did try DNA. That opens up a whole nother interesting discussion. I had the chance to not only photograph the scene and so forth, but we took one of the nests that had been avoided so that no human contact had presumably occurred. We collected soil samples, material from the bottom inner surface of the nest. Basically, I just took a core with sterile sample tubes. And then before we left, we actually took shears and we cut a pie-shaped wedge out of this circular nest and examined the stratigraphy, so to speak, the layered construction. And it wasn't just a haphazard piling up of forest duff and debris, sticks and leaves and bark and so forth. But there was a very definite structure to it, a lattice work with materials, and then these evergreen blueberries where the top sprigs were snapped off at about a 7-foot level. There was this big hedgerow of these that was kind of creating a blind, screening the nesting site perched on the edge of this very steep slope of about 300-foot height, and made a very effective dense screen we were way off the road, way off the trail. But they had clearly been snapped off at a considerable height and then not just piled, but actually woven into the nest to create kind of a springy, billowy perimeter, especially depressed in the center. It was interesting. Now, the DNA results were unsatisfactory in the sense that there wasn't an unknown primate, but the researcher, Todd Disotell at NYU, had only looked at a small fragment of a mitochondrial gene. The mitochondria are these little or cellular organelles, the powerhouses, and they have their own little loop of DNA. And since there are lots of mitochondria in the cell, it's a little easier to amplify that DNA, to make copies of it and amplify it and sequence it. So when you're doing sort of a preliminary test, they oftentimes will use mitochondrial DNA for those tests. Now, if Sasquatch is as closely related to us, certainly closer than a chimpanzee, for example, then it could differ from our DNA by 0.5%, 1/10 of a percentage, for all we know. In which case, you need to sequence a lot of DNA in order to find those few markers that differentiate us. Otherwise, everything else you look at is going to essentially look like us. And that was the result that came back on this. It had all these forest creatures that were caught up in the sample, in the probe. But no, the only primate was identified as human. So that means one of two things. Either it was a human sample, that from contamination of the sample, or the other point is that it could be just that not enough sequence was generated in order to find those distinguishing markers, and so it just looked like it was human. So there's a third one. It's kind of beyond the scope, but your dad's looked at the relic hominoid inquiry. You'll have to go back and look specifically to paper on mitochondrial introgression, which poses a really interesting third possibility, one that suggests that we can't rely on the mitochondrial DNA. We have to look at the nuclear DNA to be sure that we have the potential of identifying distinguishing characteristics there. And that's more expensive and more time consuming, and there are very few people I mean, there's so far no one, but that's very few that has expressed willingness to tackle this problem and really grapple with it, even if I'm able to provide the funding for them to do it. Because, you know, in this world of publish or perish, laboratories are absolutely dependent on renewal of grants, and they have to maintain a clean record of publication. And so if there's any gaps produced by doing more risky research or controversial research that might compromise, you know, or call into jeopardy their funding revenue stream, are just not interested.
I heard a similar argument with, totally off topic, but I heard a similar argument with trying to test DNA from the ossuaries in the Jesus tomb.
Oh,
and some of the DNA work that was tried there and roadblocks they hit with that. So you're right about the mitochondrial stuff being, I read it. My criminal justice background, it didn't prepare me for any of it. But one of the potential sources of evidence that I did understand was when you hear descriptions of things like the tree breaks up high, or more specifically the rock throwing, and instances like that. And if I remember correctly, there was an encounter or an experience that you went through that had something similar to that. And to Logan's next question, I was thinking that maybe if you had a second to recount that for him, then maybe give him context to his next question.
Right. Well, we were up in Ontario. There was a fishing cabin on a remote lake, and that part of Ontario is like a checkerboard where, you know, the red squares are water and the black squares are islands or peninsulas. It's just, there's so much water. It's this low, flat part of the Canadian Shield, just the exposed bedrock. And so there's all these shallow, you know, the glaciers just scraped everything clean. And then when they receded, they left all these little shallow depressions that filled in as lakes. But some of these lakes, you know, you can walk across because they're never more than 4 or 5 feet deep, but they're great habitat for pike and muskies and so forth. We had a great time fishing, ate lots of fresh fish, but you could only get in there by float plane. It was like a 2-hour float plane flight in from the southern part of the province, and once we were in, then supposedly there had been some occurrences at this cabin that prompted the producer to come back and bring a team. And there was even in the cabin log, the guest log, one of the guests had made an entry where they said they had found some oversized human-like footprints on the portage trail between the lakes, where they had 2 sets of boats moored. And so we were very hopeful in that something might transpire. But as chance would have it, the encounter we had was occurred one night. We would routinely stay up late around the campfire out in front of the cabin, down towards the lake shore, and stay up way late. And we would vocalize, and there was one who placed a lot of stock in wood knock, so he would beat on the tree with a baseball bat. And we occasionally got some howling, lingering kind of shrill calls in the distance. Weren't sure. I mean, it wasn't distinct enough that you could differentiate with confidence from something like a coyote. So it was just there, interesting. But then all of a sudden, well, on this last night that you know, I'm not a real night person. It's really tough for me to pull an all-nighter, and it usually wipes me out for a day or two. It throws my system all out of whack. So I'm kind of fading. You know, I'm okay up to about 11:30. You get beyond that, and I start to fade pretty fast. And I say, well, I got to go splash some water in my face or something, walk around. And so I'd gone in the cabin, and one of it was actually the son of the producer, didn't want to go back to the outhouse, which was about 30 yards behind the cabin down this catwalk in the pitch black. So he's relieving himself off the side of the porch and into the bushes, and suddenly there's this, it's like someone fired a BB gun against the metal siding of the house. And whack. And I heard it inside. And I could see it was right next to where he was standing. And man, his eyes were about this big, and he's hustling back over to the fire, hiking his pants back up. And so they were all excited about that as I came out. And so we started listening. We were all primed. And one of the fellows, Kurt Nelson, who is a molecular biologist from Minnesota, I want to say Minnesota or Wisconsin, I've gone blank. He finally he says, I'm going to throw a rock and see what happens. And I said, well, don't throw anything too big. They might take that as a invite to start throwing big ones back at us. So he throws this, golf ball sized rock over the cabin. You could hear it thunk thunk against a couple of tree trunks, and nothing happened. And so we're just kind of paying attention, but the conversation goes on. And then I was on the lake side of the fire, so looking towards the cabin, and just the firelight casting across the cabin. And so out of the corner of my eye, I saw this rock coming, not from exactly where it had been thrown, but from a different rock, but about the same size, golf ball size, coming, angling across the cabin. The cabin had this corrugated metal roofing, and bounce with, good report across that. Scared the heck out of the group. They went running into the cabin. And I said, oh, hey, this is what we're out here for. Where are you going? Later they said it was to get the camera equipment, but I think that was just an excuse. But in any case, we went out back into the woods. We had some early models of thermal imaging and night vision equipment and monoculars and binoculars, and nothing. I mean, it was very dark anyway, and it's really tough going because this Canadian shield is also fissured all over the place and crevices, but the moss grows like crazy in the understory. And so it's like there's all these pit traps everywhere. And if you go walking around willy-nilly, you can easily step in or fall into one of these, break a leg. So we were being kind of cautious as we investigated. But I mean, anything could have if you just stood still against a tree trunk, you wouldn't be able to see it, except maybe with the thermal. And the thermal was it had to be mounted on a tripod. It was this very expensive, very cumbersome model, not like what we've got today. In any case, to make a long story short, eventually about 2 in the morning, 2:30, I said, hey, look, I'm going to fall asleep and fall in the fire. You're going to have to life flight me out of here. So I'm going to go to bed. And nothing was happening for quite some time. And so we all agreed, yeah, it's time to go to bed, but let's keep our boots on. We'll turn off the lights, but everyone be ready just in case. And I'm telling you, no sooner lights went out, my lids got heavy, when all of a sudden, whack, bonk, bonk, bonk across the roof again. Well, this time it wasn't a little rock. It was a chunk of cordwood from the wood pile out back. There was a wood shed and a cutting yard, with all the sawdust from the chainsaws and split wood piled up underneath the cover, so it wouldn't become completely snowbound. And so something had picked up a chunk of that cordwood and heaved it onto the roof, and you could see it had bounced off and fallen off behind onto the stoop. But the next day, I mean, you could see the divots in the roof where it had bounced and made dents in the metal roofing. Anyway, at that point, we were less inclined to go running out if it was raining cordwood. So we're watching. I said, turn the lights out, keep the lights out, and watching through the windows. Well, we never saw anything and nothing. So we waited, and watched. And I was hoping, because there was a bit of a clearing back behind through which the catwalk went back to the outhouse. I was hoping something would cross through that gap. Sometimes animals, when it is really dark, they're a little more bold about breaking cover. And with night vision, you can then see them, witness them. But that wasn't to happen. And so eventually, we turned in and just continued our investigation in the morning. So that was interesting. I mean, you stop and think. I mean, there's really only two possibilities. One would be because there aren't any animals that have opposable thumbs or the ability to pick up rocks or pick up cordwood and heave it onto a roof with accuracy like that, or other than a human. So our group was accounted for. We'd been there for 5 days straight. The only way in was by float plane. I mean, to hike across country up there in that kind of terrain is just really, I mean, it's, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's very impractical. And so others have suggested, some tribal people from the neighboring reservation came over to jerk on your chain a little bit and get you excited, but I think that's extremely unlikely, if not altogether out of the question. So that by default, that's an assumption, an inference we drew. So going back to your comments about evidence, we don't know for sure what we experienced, whether Sasquatch was responsible for that or not, but it seems like a real possibility. Let's put it that way. I won't even go so far as say the most likely possibility. I got one time someone and rightly so said, well, okay, well, what you say? Well, it's I think we were talking about these big footprints and that were found up in Alaska, and that a grizzly bear never gets or rarely gets beyond a certain length. And the argument came back. So it's less likely that there was a slightly oversized grizzly bear, you're saying, but more likely that an unrecognized, unknown relic hominoid was responsible for leaving those footprints. And of course, it's more than just the length. That's the thing. He was simplifying as in a rhetorical fashion, simplifying the argument beyond reason, that made it ridiculous, if all you're going to judge it by is length, because I'm interested in the overall morphology, all the aspects that we use to differentiate the tracks. So
that was kind of village or not, would you go outside if a big piece of wood had been thrown on top of the
Yeah. I'd rather not get hit in the head by a piece of wood.
Right.
Yeah.
It was probably just a bear. It was probably just a bear. That's what I keep. Yeah. Just a bear. All right. Ask him this next one.
Okay. Could Bigfoot be in North Carolina?
Yes, actually, I think so. The rule of thumb, there was a paper published recently from which I derived this rule of thumb, or this kind of guideline. The paper was testing the efficacy of, or the reliability of, ecological modeling software packages. And in this editorial, it was actually an editorial, not a research paper per se, but it was a very solid editorial paper. To demonstrate their caution, the reason for their caution, what they did is they proposed to test these modeling softwares using some ostensibly bogus, that is, what was in their minds very likely fake, or in other people's minds likely fake data, to see how it was treated by the software model, to model a distribution and habitat maps, and predictions about where a given species might exist based on extrapolating those features. And so what they did, their ostensibly bogus data took the form of Sasquatch reports. So they got these data sets, some from the BFRO, from an organization that has an online data set, and other sources, and they crunched the numbers. And these are professional geographic information systems technicians, GIS techs. And one I know very well. He graduated from the University of Colorado, and we've been in contact since he was a student there and did his senior honors thesis on a GIS analysis of the distribution of reported distribution of Sasquatch in Pacific Northwest over a 20-year period, looking at changes in patterns and if there was any rational basis for it. It was really quite fascinating. He got an A+ on his paper. But he was one of the authors. And so what came out of it was the model produced by these various software packages for Bigfoot was remarkably similar to that for black bears. And so much so that in their paper, they said, well, here's a potential explanation for Bigfoot sightings. They occur where there are black bear, and they are very likely just misidentified black bear encounters. Well, I got on the phone to one of the author that I knew, and I said, hey, what gives? And I thought you were on our side. I thought you were at least optimistic about this whole thing. And he said, Jeff, you more than anyone should recognize that had we even suggested in our manuscript, in our paper, that this data actually indicated there might really be a logical basis for Sasquatch, we would never have gotten it published. It would have been rejected. So we had to sort of adopt this tongue-in-cheek approach to the proposition and treat it as ostensibly bogus in order to get it past the reviewers. But he said, I'll have you know that my two co-authors, who at the outset were rather skeptical of this whole exercise, they're now really quite intrigued. They were so impressed by the results of this Sasquatch data that now they're asking more questions. He said, I've got them both reading your book. So the rule of thumb coming out of that is, if a bear can make a living in a given habitat, if there still are viable black bear populations, then that habitat presumably would be suitable for a large omnivorous mammal species like Sasquatch. So in North Carolina, I don't know what the statistics are right off the bat, but there's probably, several thousand black bear. And we've done some exercises, and we're kind of pushing the envelope of, I don't want to say speculation, of inference, drawing hypothetical conclusions based on different clues, patterns, and behaviors and anatomies. And these include things like clues about their possible social structure, the fact that they are large-bodied primates, drawing correlation or extrapolation from other ape species, aspects of their natural history. So to make a long story short, we come up with kind of a home range size of about 1,000 square miles for a Sasquatch, and a social structure that's very similar in many ways, pardon me, to an orangutan, where the male dominates not a harem of females, but dominates a territory. And that territory happens to include some females who, when they are on those rare occasions, and it can be years between births, orangutans usually average about 6 to 7 years between giving birth to offspring. So when they're receptive to becoming pregnant, they seek out the dominant male to be the father. So if the dominant male has the real estate, then he demonstrates he's the top, he's the king of the orangutans in that region. The ladies come to him. That's probably, all of Sasquatch reports and footprint find seem to indicate solitary individuals or females with offspring or young adults, subadults in tow. So the second rule of thumb is about 1 to 200 black bear for every one Sasquatch, given their racial distribution. Now, like I said, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head for North Carolina, but I'd wager that it's probably in the range of about 2 to 3,000. So that means, if you lop off, if you take 3,000, say, lop off 2 zeros and cut that in half, then we're talking about 15 Sasquatch in North Carolina.
And those 15 would be concentrated theoretically around where the black bear habitat might be, right?
Right. Yeah,
So
dispersed.
how
Yeah,
have
dispersed.
you ever been to a black bear?
How close can you get a grandfather?
Oh, there was a black bear on the deck last year.
Yeah.
I drove past a black bear a couple weeks ago. They walked across campus at my school.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, they're around. And of course,
So-
there'll be other factors influencing the actual distribution within that potential habitat. So, black bears can become conditioned to human sources of food quite readily. Sasquatch maybe, but maybe they're smart enough to stay out of sight, stay out of the way, and maybe where there are humans around, as there's been precedent with other primates. The primates stay out of sight and are only active at night, even though they're not primarily nocturnal. There seems to be evidence to suggest that Sasquatch are as or more active at night than during the daytime. Not exclusively nocturnal, and so those kind of things all have to be taken into account. But yeah. So 15 doesn't sound like much, but of course, they don't recognize state boundaries. So you have to kind of look at the whole swath of of that Piedmont, up against the Appalachia, and excuse me, can't get my voice here. It's quite different up in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, here in Idaho, we have 35,000 black bear. So it's more like 200 Sasquatch versus 15, and you repeat that for the other states, and that's in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. Then you start adding that up, and then you include, say, British Columbia. There's 110,000 black bear in British Columbia, and I can't remember what the number is for Alberta. It's quite a bit fewer, but the point is, you start adding all those up, and pretty soon you're up 2,000, 2,500, 33,000 Sasquatch in North America. That's a sustainable population for a large-bodied animal that reproduces slowly, that has a long lifespan. See, black bears live to be 20, 25 years of age. An ape of this size, because there's a positive correlation, longer lifespan with larger body mass, could easily live to be 50, 60 years old in the wild. In zoos, chimps and gorillas easily live to be 60. I think the oldest right now is about 60, just celebrated her 62nd birthday. I can't remember which zoo she's at now. There was one, Gorgeous the gorilla was 60 when she passed away at Salt Lake Zoo, the Hogle Zoo, south of here. But anyway, yeah.
I'm telling you, we have black bear and the Unabomber hit up here, so we've got to have a Sasquatch somewhere.
Sure.
All right, here's the most important one.
This podcast is designed to answer the questions to our listeners. The questions our listeners didn't know to ask. What questions do you feel is most important to answer that we haven't thought to ask you?
Oh, gee. Yeah, that one always catches me. Let's see here. Well, I think it always seems to me that it's imperative for people to, in order for them to have an open mind to the possibility, let alone the probability of the existence of such a creature, they have to have an appreciation for the context of this, because it has gotten because science took such a hands-off attitude early on in the 50s and 60s, even in the 70s, that the whole subject of Sasquatch got relinquished sort of to the tabloid, the stuff of National Enquirer and so on. And of course, that gets perpetuated by some of the silliness that takes place on cable television shows and so on. It's always a bit of it's a bit of a crapshoot for me when I agree to participate in some of these, because I have no creative control. I have no final say. And if they're unscrupulous, and there's fewer of those, early on had trouble with some who would take your words and twist them, or would set you up with what was obviously a hoax, and would not provide the information that you really need in order to draw a rational conclusion. But in order, so to get past that, in order for people to take the topic as a potentially serious scientific question, they have to appreciate the context. And so a lot of our discussion, I would kind of, it might seem to other people I'm getting off into the weeds. It's because you have to establish the white lines on the road to frame the discussion. And unless you can appreciate the evidence within that context, and be able to grapple with the science, then it's just going to stay a tabloid story. It's going to stay a sensational, anecdote, which, fable, a legend, a myth. So that's the questions, I think, that are very important are those that help to establish that framework about what we have learned as far as the evolutionary history. Just this recognition of what I described, the bushy tree, that changed the whole way in which anthropologists should look at this question. And along with that bushiness, the diversity, the recognition that several of these lineages, these branches on that bushy tree, have persisted alongside us until the very recent time, if not the present. And when you've got these two things converging, the growing evidence for the possible existence of Sasquatch and other relic hominoids, and the fossil record that keeps pushing the occurrence younger and younger, to more and more recent times, eventually they're going to meet. And we're going to finally have the evidence that we need in order to connect those dots. I reviewed a book recently that was written by a colleague of mine from the University of Alberta. He's a cultural anthropologist. He did his research down in Southeast Asia, where he studied these stories of a diversity of stories, but he was very keenly interested in the stories of the wild man that they had. And they struck him because of his familiarity with all the other stories about woodland creatures, that some real, but many are that were mythological. This one, the wild man, stuck out, in his opinion, as very different. He acknowledged that the people talked about this as if it was a real creature, that this shouldn't be lumped in with the folkloric figures, but really should be included with the flesh and blood biological species in the forest. He now just published, so he published a great book, a very scholarly book, but it's extremely pricey and goes over the head of most casual readers. So as he retired, he wrote a popular book for a more general audience, but he was even more straightforward in connecting the dots between these little people stories that he was writing about and studying in Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular, and the hobbit, Homo floresiensis, which was discovered on the very island of Flores where he was doing his doctoral research, just on the other side of the mountains. And so he makes a real strong case that, hey, this is the simplest explanation. It's the most credible explanation, is that these stories are about these creatures, and that they're still telling stories about seeing these creatures even today. So, yeah, there you go. There's one example.
And the where I got into it and where it comes in with my classes is exactly the point of evidence.
Yeah.
So, we talk about the JFK assassination, moon landing, even like the Jesus tombs and things of that nature. And I bring it all back to the context of processing evidence, because, we teach in the criminal justice, we are teaching them introductory to the justice system,
Right.
all the way to more specialized courses. And so when I'm asking them, I'm like, at what point do you have enough evidence? At what point has the evidence been presented to you to make a decision? And then I tie it back to being a juror or being someone accused at the
Right.
defense table, that kind of thing. So I always bring it back to, we don't have a body, so do you have enough evidence? And I always call it the Bigfoot effects. I'm like, okay, do we have enough evidence, or are you still in the Bigfoot camp where we don't have a body? And it just that was kind of where I got introduced or interested in it and how it fits into my courses. These guys have just been they've had to suffer long while Dad may or may not sit and watch those terrible shows. So,
right,
Logan,
that's
the
great.
question is, do you have enough evidence? What do you think?
I feel like there's a lot of scientific evidence behind it.
Uh-huh.
Like, then again, we don't have a body.
But we don't have a body.
Right.
You wanna call it and say yes, so that when those two do converge, you can be like, when I was 11 on my podcast, I called
it. Yeah.
There you go. Hold out.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of evidence behind it being real.
Yeah.
But like, then again, there's a lot saying that it's not.
There's still a lot missing, right? A lot of possible explanations.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say that, yeah, he is real, but like, I could be wrong.
It's okay. It's your show.
Yeah. Well, and it's a very interesting what's the word I'm after? It's an important point, because in my experience, there are people who, in the process of taking me to task for their misconception that I'm trying to convince people that Sasquatch is real, which is, I can understand how they can take that away when they don't understand the process of presenting evidence. And of course, like I said, I'm convinced. So sometimes I may not couch my statements as tentatively as they would think I should, because I'm convinced by the accumulated evidence. It's only a matter of time until a body. There is no other explanation in my mind to account for, X, Y, and Z having occurred. But for them, that becomes a stumbling block. They get so distracted by what they think is me trying to proselytize and convert people to my point of view, that then they miss the forest for the trees. They don't see and appreciate the evidence itself, which is the basis of my being convinced. And so my argument is always, hey, I'm just laying out the evidence. You have to make up your mind. It's going to say a lot about you as to how you engage and how you evaluate that evidence, whether as far as your objectivity or your education or, information at your disposal. But so it's, to put Logan on the spot there, it really is it's a challenging position in order to convey a reasonable stance, a reasonable posture in relationship to the question.
Well, thank you for coming on here and talking to us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It's been it's all, doesn't take much of a nudge to get me talking about this. So, getting me to shut up is sometimes the more challenging part of it. So well, I hope the answers were good.
We couldn't be more grateful. And I loved it because, like I said, this has been a year-long thing, and it's been awesome to watch him grow and just kind of take the reins with it. And for an anniversary to be a topic that obviously is something I enjoy. But, you know, the whole premise behind the show is that he's answering questions for people they didn't know to ask. And I've heard the Bigfoot explanation be so far as Bigfoot is Cain from Cain and Abel in the Bible, perpetually walking the earth, and that's, you know, like all kinds of stuff out there. And so I think not only are we answering the question tonight to the listeners to form their own opinion of, is Bigfoot real, but it's also a bigger question of how we as humans, we as a society, given societies, process evidence, filter information, communicate information, and what we do with that. And so it's just a fun way to kind of deep dive in ourselves in those types of conversations. So,
absolutely.
You know, I really appreciate this. I really appreciate you taking the time to get on with him. And Logan, I'm really proud of you. I think you've done a great job preparing for this and navigating this. So,
indeed,
nice work, man.
Congratulations. Yeah, great.
So, Dr. Meldrum, thank you so much for taking the time out, especially on a Friday and with all the hoops and things there. So you've been amazing.
Okay, good deal. Take care.
Thank you, sir. You too.